wonderful to see so many familiar and new faces here. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This is a great excuse for us to discuss America's policy towards Central Asia. I've been waiting for this panel for a long time, and I'm so happy that it's happening here at the Central Asia program, at this conference, with this specific crowd. I think there is a lot that we could learn from our guests today. I'm Navbahor. I work with Voice of America. I've been covering U.S. Central Asia policy since the early 2000s, watching it closely, and I have known our guests for a long time. I have talked to them both on the air and off the record, and I know that they are incredibly candid people. I've always admired their brilliance, openness, energy, of course. We have Ambassador Laura Kennedy, Ambassador Pamela Spratlen, and Ambassador George Krol. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. You would think that these veteran diplomats are relaxing now, but no. They are very busy doing all sorts of interesting things. Some of them are traveling, writing, teaching, and sharing their knowledge, wisdom, and experience. I have, the thing about being a journalist, of course, you think you have access to everything. Here in Washington, you don't. You have to fight for it, always. And I've never gotten enough of these ambassadors, and now former ambassadors. I never have enough time to engage them. So it'll be hard for me to share my time with them and with you. But we will, we have about 2 hours here, so we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. And I'm more than sure that we'll get a lot of great questions here, and also our discussion will generate some interesting questions that we haven't even thought about before. I will briefly introduce our speakers again, just providing some bios, and then we will get to know them more as they speak. So Ambassador Kennedy, she's a career foreign service officer of nearly 40 years. Her history with Central Asia goes back to the late 1970s, which I'm really, really interested in hearing more. She was ambassador to Turkmenistan, and in fact she was the first ambassador to Turkmenistan, and she served there from 2001 to 2003. Weren't you the ambassador, right? Before you, there were basically chiefs of mission.
Well, no, Joe Hewlings, Mike Cotter, and my good friend Steve Mann. So actually, no, I was fourth.
Okay. So, and then you became the Deputy Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs.
I only wish. Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Deputy DAS. And then she also taught at National War College. Then she was appointed as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. We remember that. And then you were also Special Representative for Biological Weapons and Convention issues in 2010. And then, after you retired, you were called back again to serve in Turkmenistan, which I believe was in 2014. Then you served at the U.S. mission to the UN, so you've been,
I've been around.
Yeah, you've been around. And she's been traveling to the region lately, actually doing educational tours, so we want to hear about that. Ambassador Spratlen spent this decade in Central Asia, I think it's safe to say that, serving as America's top diplomat in Kyrgyzstan, and then she went to Uzbekistan after that. She also worked at the U.S. Embassy in Kazakhstan. I first met her when she was the Director of Central Asian Affairs at the State Department. And then you also briefly became DAS.
Acting DAS for
And then you went to Kyrgyzstan. So you recently retired, but you're still involved and around. Ambassador Krol, I was just watching our interview from 2008. And you still look the same, but I don't. It's been 11 years. I'm like, really? That was when you were DAS too, focused on Central Asia, and then Ambassador Krol went to Belarus. After that, he went to Uzbekistan and then to Kazakhstan. At some point, Ambassador Spratlen and Ambassador Krol basically switched places. I know you're affiliated with Harvard University's Davis Center now, lucky them. And you live in Rhode Island, so we really appreciate this trip all the way here. As I said, this roundtable is something that I envisioned for a long time, and this is a great, unique opportunity for us to look deeper into the realities of managing these complex relationships Washington has with the region. We want to definitely highlight the intricacies. We want to talk about things that working diplomats wouldn't be discussing. So I'm going to challenge our guests to be as candid as possible and tell us about things that they couldn't talk to us then. I want to throw some central questions here, and this will be for all of you to get this discussion, started. And then I have some specific questions too. So, what were the driving factors of U.S. policy in Central Asia when you started there as ambassadors at different times, of course? What kind of challenges and opportunities do you see now? You've been out recent. And then, what kind of the U.S. strategy? How has it been evolving, or has it been evolving at all? Because many of us think, and I know a lot of people here in the room think that it's been static and it's been quite outdated. And what defines America in the region now? What is so special about American presence? What is so special about America's offering to Central Asia? We want some specific examples. And then, how should Washington regard and deal with the leaders in the region now? So those are some of the general things that we're really interested in today. I would like to start with Ambassador Kennedy. Because again, we want to get some historic perspective. I know in 1978, when some of us were just born, you were an official exchange exhibit guide in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, something that you told me recently. How did that happen? I'm thinking this had something to do with Afghanistan too, because the U.S. involvement in the region also has something to do with the fact that around that time the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan.
Okay, well, thank you. And as I say, I've had almost 40 years with the State Department, so if I start telling war stories, please just cut me off. Especially since I am going to go back and start in 1978, when I was actually on my first overseas tour at our embassy in Moscow, and was sort of sent TDY as an exhibit guide with these exhibits. And I mention that because, one, it was my first exposure to Central Asia. Our exhibit was in what was then Leningrad. And of course, when I came back later and saw it when it was Astana, and then of course the massive growth, I literally could not find places that I remember from my time there. But I mention that because it gave me an enduring appreciation for the value of public diplomacy. And that's been sort of certainly a theme in my career. And when you talked about what the U.S. has to offer, I think some of the things that public diplomacy highlights are some of the things that are enduring U.S. strengths. But no, had nothing to do with Afghanistan at that point. It was before the invasion. It was 1978. It was part of actually a series of exhibits we had going back to 1956, the first one in Moscow, which featured the famous kitchen debate with Nixon and Khrushchev. So this was a series that went on for many years, gave us an opportunity to live and work in areas outside that diplomatic ghetto in Moscow. So again, very, very, I think, extraordinary experience that I and other exhibit guides had. And again, it gave so many former Soviet citizens their first experience actually talking to someone from the West. That was the case, for example, at Leningrad, which was not an inter-east city. So anyhow, that was my first taste. When independence came, I was serving in Turkey, and I had the opportunity to go with an OSCE mission to visit all the new states. And interesting time because to be in Turkey, since I couldn't be in Moscow, where the real action was. But it was fascinating to see Turkey sort of rediscovering its old ties and its new interest in the area. And of course, they were very interested in partnering with us, which was fine, although I think they sort of oversold it a little bit by trying to present themselves as a conduit or an intermediary, whereas I think we had no interest. I mean, we wanted to engage directly. Now, when I think back on U.S. policy, I see three distinct, or roughly, periods. The first from independence up till 9/11. The second, basically, after 9/11, where Afghanistan, as you mentioned earlier, was very much a part of our thinking in Afghanistan. And I see ourselves sort of morphing into slowly a third period, where, clearly this president is looking for a way out of Afghanistan. But let me go back to the first period, where I think we had, three largely main interests. The first is one that carries over very much till today, and that is basically supporting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of these new states. We were very interested and eager to assist them in joining and becoming anchored in a whole range of international and regional organizations. Energy, of course, Kazakhstan being a major oil power, I think, again, we helped them develop their industry and break sort of the old Russian monopoly. It was never about anti-Russian, as with everything. It was just giving these new nations choices. So in energy, basically our mantra was always enhance and diversify. Turkmenistan, of course, I don't know how many oceans of sweat we spent trying to develop a Trans-Caspian pipeline, or the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. Again, it was always about enhancing and diversifying, giving them the wherewithal to ideally use these resources for their development. But as Teresa Sabonis Health knows so well, petroleum is very much a mixed blessing, or some would even say a petroleum curse, because you have that cash cow and it gives you that cushion so that you do not, you're not forced to buy your population support more. Okay, third major category, I'd say WMD. And I've spent a lot of my career working in disarmament and non-proliferation, so I always highlight this one. Again, you look at Kazakhstan with its nuclear arsenal, huge arsenal, signing the Budapest Memorandum, which also covered, of course, the other legacy nuclear states, transferring those nuclear material out to Russia, helping them dismantle their infrastructure was extremely valuable. But again, all of Central Asia had bits and pieces of this. I think about the bio program in Uzbekistan, which was truly a pretty scary place, believe me. In all the states, we helped set up programs like export controls, border monitoring, and so on. Another, of course, interest was regional cooperation. I'd say almost that was one of the toughest. I don't know if Alexander Cooley's at this conference, but I know in his book, it was at Great Games, Local Rules, whatever, talked about the formidable barriers that grew up, and why countries oftentimes had no interest in enhancing the cooperation, because there was reasons not to. So that was a tough one, but we really tried hard. And things like water sharing, water pricing, again, very tough. We looked at our aid programs, and I was talking with Gavin Helf about this. In a regional way, we based our aid programs in Almaty, and if you want to ask me about sort of the lessons learned, I think, frankly, that might have made sense at the beginning. We were much too slow, I think, to keep that, and George may disagree, having been ambassador to Kazakhstan, I think to keep that regionally based. And I think Uzbekistan is still in the process of setting up an independent aid mission. Anyhow, but you all may have different views. But certainly in Turkmenistan, Niyazov had an allergy to anything that was not based in Turkmenistan. So he really, and his folks, were not interested in talking to a specialist who may have been the world's greatest expert on, say, tuberculosis management, but, they came from Kazakhstan. Again, Uzbekistan, I think, is so much the story today in terms of giving us the new opportunities, because that was also very much part of the problem with regional cooperation, because we had that sort of central country in the middle that was not a big fan of open borders. Now, if I had to actually grade us, I'd say for that first period, I'd give us some pretty good grades. We were right in there from the beginning in terms of recognizing these countries. We stood up fully staffed embassies in every single one of the republics. Now, that may seem like, not a big deal, We did it without any new resources from Congress. That amounted to basically a 10% cut in the State Department personnel and resources that took us many years to recover from. But I think it was important because it gave the countries the sense that we were investing in their future. And I think they got pretty good attention from the State Department. Certainly then when we turned to the second chapter with 9/11, clearly Afghanistan became the focus. It was certainly a major focus of my time in Turkmenistan. Again, fairly good attention from the area. I'd say that there was a shift, at least I felt it in Turkmenistan when we went into Iraq. I just felt the momentum going out of our effort in Afghanistan. I still think of it as lost opportunities, and I know this is revisionist historian and what ifs aren't any good, but I do see that as a change. Now I think we're sort of, as I say, on the cusp of a way forward. I know that the U.S. has a new policy that they want to unveil at some point. My sense is it will be marked very much by continuity. Again, that same focus on the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity will certainly be a thing. Developing sustainability of programs there. But the big change from my time is the rise of China. I think we were a little slow in the early years to see the role that it would play. And I think it's really going to be interesting to see how this works out. Because after all, we do have an administration now who talks about great power competition. That sees China as the enemy rather than, a big stakeholder in the area. And if there's one thing that I'd say, certainly about the earlier years, we did not try and make these countries choose among countries. We recognized, or at least I think we tried to, that of course they had major ties with Russia. China certainly has economically a lot. So I hope we can keep that and not try and put them on the spot and make them choose. So I've gone on way too long, but that's some thoughts about my years in the State Department.
Thank you. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
but I was going to say, my last chapter was, since I left government in 2015, I went back to the New York Times and then most recently with the Smithsonian last month to Central Asia as a way just to sort of keep my hand in. And again, China, China, China. And again, that earlier theme I had about soft power, aside from what you read about economics, think about this. When I was in Tashkent, I went down, I got on the subway. There's monitors in the subway station that were playing the Confucius Institute ads sort of for Chinese language nonstop in the subway. When I was in Bishkek at the airport, free newspapers, both in Kyrgyz and in Chinese, which were newspapers put out by China. So again, they know what soft power is, although I prefer to think of soft power in terms of smart power. Public diplomacy is one of the tools that you should use. So China, 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 but again, I think how do we work with these countries, with China, with all the stakeholders to try and see what are the common elements in our outlooks, how can we work together, and if we can't, then how do you smartly deal with those differences? So, sorry for that.
Thank you.
Postscript.
Thank you. Ambassador Spratlen?
I'm thinking if you're thinking of this in terms of time, perhaps George should speak next, because he also is deep in the region and was in Kazakhstan, has been there a long time, and then since I'm newer, I'll finish up.
Pamela, that's a diplomatic trick.
That's a strategy.
This is a true strategic view, because you want the last word, if that's going to be the last word in the region.
No, we have plenty of questions
I bow
coming.
to your expertise and everything.
The microphones are on.
Yeah, I guess.
You need to put them closer.
Or,
I mean, I can hear loud.
there it is. How's that?
Oh, much better. Oh, that was
Keep them close to the mouth.
Okay, I'll swallow. Well, what can I say after Laura Kennedy has spoken? Since I mean, we all go back a long ways, and so it's great to be out of the U.S. government. But how to get over the habits of minding what you say in public and things like that as well. But I can see the whole gamut here. When I see Clark Adams there, Department of Defense, Steve Swerdlow, Human Rights Watch there, it's like, my God, this is my life back to the future and the like too, because You know, if we're focusing on Central Asia, when I first started, when I became DAS for Central Asia in 2008, and then for those sins went to Uzbekistan, and for those sins went to Kazakhstan at the end. You know, I would say the time that I was dealing with Central Asia in Washington, and then also in Uzbekistan, particularly, and then Kazakhstan, you know, the challenges that I had to face, and I think many of us did, is juggling the various interests that the United States government in its many forms, namely Congress, namely the administration, namely the Department of Defense, various bureaus in the State Department, the non-governmental organization, community, diasporas and the like that all play into American foreign policy, which makes it, when you're an ambassador or you're a DAS, you're trying to help in formulating that, it becomes a mishmash of a lot of interests, and you're wondering, well, what are really our key priority interests? And I think I look at Clark, and I know Pamela has worked on this too. I think every administration, and even in the terms, like, you know, most of them have had 2 terms, you know, since I've been there, 2 Bushes, 2 Obamas, now there's Trump, but, and the like. And even when they change at midterm and there's a new Secretary of State, there's always a new strategy, and there was always a new strategy for Central Asia. Like this one, it hasn't been born yet, but even when I left, I retired at the end of 2018, this was in the works. I don't think it'll basically change much, because it's like, you know, it's everything thrown into the pot together. Clark, I mean, you must have seen everything. So, you know, it's an exercise. It's an yeah. You can just nod or not or whatever. But when you're out in the field and you're in Washington, and how do you explain this and everything? You know, you're juggling all of these interests. Like, for instance, you know, the fact we have troops in Afghanistan, they need to be supplied, and the big interest in having the transit routes through Central Asia to supply the troops and the coalition troops there is a very high priority, certainly for the Department of Defense, for the combatant commanders, as something that would be vital American interests. And yet, so that meant you needed to work with the governments of Central Asia, and in my case, Uzbekistan, because they sit astride that, in order to ensure that they can get, the United States can get that access across. You know, leading to something like, you know, a phone call that President Obama had to make to Islam Karimov, who at the time, you know, was, because of Andijan events and that whole history that predated me of the withdrawal from the K2 base, and the condemnation of the Karimov's handling of Andijan, and all the imprisonments and things like that ensued, or it even predated that. You know, you had to work with this government, which was very sensitive to how it was treated and the like as well, in order to get this essential piece of the American security architecture in place. Now that, of course, was something that, you know, it was at a presidential level. The president himself, who may not have really wanted to call, but, you know, felt that was the only way we were going to get this, was to call. And the same with, you know, with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and even before that. But this, of course, runs in the face of having this relationship and wanting to maintain this, with all the concerns that come from Congress, that come from the non-governmental organization community and the like, about, well, the nature of these governments, how they're dealing with their own people and the like as well, and how do you balance this of how you deal with this government, where you need something from them, very important, but you don't want to lose that, because how you handle all these other issues, which are very important to American constituents, if you will, you know, it puts you in this. That's the true diplomacy of how you deal with all of these elements, with an eye of how can you advance them incrementally at some points and everything for the kind of relationship that you want to have that can be productive for all the various interests you have. I mean, similarly in Kazakhstan, there is, in addition to transit, you also have oil and big American companies that are there, vital to Kazakhstan, vital to these companies, vital to U.S. commercial interests. And so how you deal with Kazakhstan in its own, in the issue of how it's dealing with its own people and things like that, and how do you respond to it, publicly or privately, confidentially, the type of conversations that you have, it's one of the great challenges of being an ambassador, but also being a deputy assistant secretary. Being a deputy assistant secretary for Central Asia back here, it's often, your real challenge is the U.S. government and how it functions or doesn't function. Because you have all, as I said, of all these different elements, when you had these meetings at the National Security Council, presumably chaired by the NSC on Central Asia, you'd have 15 people around the table, sometimes all with a different point of view of what they wanted. The Department of Energy, of course, the Department of Defense, the Bureau of Human Rights at the State Department, which kind of was separate from the rest of the State Department in some respects. But you had all of these, which, again, it was very good to have all of these people around the table, but at the end of the day, what did you have? What kind of a policy can you have to pursue when you have, because somebody has to make a decision, and that's the matter who does and who can. On certain cases, the president does. But in most cases, it's a lot of, yes, we want to do this, we want to do that, and the others, and then you're like kind of left with, okay, how do you try to move on all these various elements? So that is one of the great challenges of being an ambassador. But when you're out in the field and you're wondering, my God, Washington, what are they thinking? That becomes like it's the most complicated. Your biggest challenge I found as an ambassador is Washington, not generally the government you're dealing with and the like. They're pretty consistent, for better or for worse. It's Washington with its many things like saying, can anybody really tell me what is our policy? You can nod, Clark, knowingly. But I think that is, and so when you talk about U.S. strategy, strategizing about Central Asia, from the very beginning, it's like, what do we really know about these places? And I'd have to say, as somebody who, like Laura was sort of present at the beginning, although I started in Ukraine and Belarus and everything, is how little we know and knew about these countries and what makes them, what's the texture, all the internal issues of their society and their culture. And, America comes in, okay, we have an embassy and everything, but we want to do all these things. We want to modernize, we want to build, nation build, but on what that we don't even understand. Which is why, the type of studies that you all do here are so important, but I wish that they could filter into our policy making because they really don't. There's lots of stuff written and everything too, but, does it make sense to policymakers who are focused on, constituents you have, down in that dome building there, or the White House, or business in that as well, which is real how policies are really kind of made, and yet these countries and what they are, their texture, the types of domestic, cultural, social issues as they're emerging from the collapse of the Soviet Union, you don't really have time to focus and even think about it. And the fact that we don't really have cadres of people in the State Department or in the U.S. government who really know and think about these countries in this region of the world. It's been one of the most sort of remote in that respect. Now there's a lot of Russia or China and the like. And those are all, of course, big issues we could talk about for hours, like how we looked at Central Asia through the prism of our relationship with Russia or China. And it's always been kind of an object rather than coming out of Central Asia itself, it seemed to me. So those are big challenges that I have seen as an ambassador and and back in Washington, how the U.S. looks at many areas of the world through the prism of America and our society and as a diplomat, you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of the people in the country that you're in, of course representing the United States and those interests, to be able to explain that country and how it functions to your people back in Washington, but also trying to explain how Washington works or the United States to the people in those countries. And they said, my God, is it really that? And I'd always say, well, that's why in our currency we have "In God We Trust," because it's like, we think we are. I mean, somebody must love us because of that. Any event, that's basically what I wanted to say. So thanks.
That's good. Thank you.
Do you-
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, it's hard to follow that, George.
Easy.
No, Navbahor, I want to thank you, first of all, for moderating this panel, and thank everyone who has come today. You've already heard some of the names of the illustrious people we have in the audience, and I just want to note that we also have a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia, Evan Feigenbaum, is here from Carnegie, and one of the ambassadors, former ambassador of the Kyrgyz Republic to Washington, Kadir Toftagulov, Gavin Help, you've already heard, Clark Adams, and Robin Schulman, who's here from the International Religious Freedom Office. Let's see, anybody else?
President of the American University of
That's
Central
right.
Asia.
Andy Kutchin.
Andy Kutchin, right there.
Fantastic, absolutely wonderful, fantastic. So, I guess my feeling is we could certainly have more expertise in the U.S. government, but this room actually shows that there's a lot of expertise about Central Asia that has developed over the years. Oh, we didn't mention Steve Sverdlov from Human Rights Watch, who's here. So there are a lot of people who followed Central Asia very, very carefully for a long time and who are very interested in what the United States is doing there at any given time. And I think that's extremely important, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that, because I think that while George is talking about the downside of having all these voices, all these spoons in the soup of U.S. foreign policy and how frustrating that can be, these are also voices of interest, people who are trying to do things on behalf of the United States that in their view are important to do. And it's our job as ambassadors, or if we're in the front offices of the bureaus, to try to moderate all this stuff along with the president's agenda, that's what the secretary is saying, put it all together and try to keep that, policy momentum going. I would say, just listening to what my esteemed colleagues have said, is that your question was about the driving forces. And I would say what's interesting about them is that they've been the same from the very beginning. So I wouldn't necessarily say that our policy is static, but I would say there are certain elements that are important to the United States and that we are going to keep worrying about those and trying to find a way to shape a policy around those interests or values. And it's going to change a little bit with each administration, but those things are important. What have we heard about? Security, a fundamental challenge for the United States, particularly at the breakup of the former Soviet Union. I think that our Secretary of State, Baker, going around, riding around and setting up embassies everywhere, making it very clear that we were interested in a whole range of issues. And I think the breadth of his interest, starting with, remember, nukes, that was a real serious concern that we had at the time about what was going to happen. What kinds of independent states would these be? And then how could the United States use its resources, use its power to try to help a part of the world that was extremely important but fracturing in a way that no one could really predict exactly what would happen, and to establish what some of those basic parameters of U.S. policy would be in terms of security, in terms of wanting to build a market economy, in terms of American values, if we could find a way to pursue that, culture, beyond exhibit guides, but trying to understand where these societies were. And then all of the connectivity, this had been one country. Now we're talking about independent states. Now they're not all looking to Moscow. They're trying to, or we hope, begin to communicate with one another. So there was a lot to do. And so while I know that Alexander Cooley in his book talks about these different phases, I think it's important for us to just note that we're really still in the early phases of the development of these states. They are not old countries. I mean, our own country is not that old. And these states are even newer. And so worrying about things like the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, and the independence of states is critically important. And I think it was important when these states were first established, and I think it's important now, because threats to sovereignty, threats to territorial integrity, threats to independence are happening every day. We all only have to open our newspapers and see, I think what happened in 2014 in Ukraine, was a huge wake-up call for the whole region. So there have been some, I only say that to say there's been some basic parameters of U.S. policy that have been pretty enduring, and that's been one of them, and I think it's extremely important that that continue. And I certainly hope in our new strategy that we'll remember that these countries are still new, and that in order for them to continue as sovereign and independent states with the many challenges that they face, they need a country like the United States. And you asked, what does the United States bring? The United States brings that fundamental concern about this basic strategic issue for every one of these countries, and I think that's extremely important. Energy, obviously that's been an extremely important part of our relationships. When George was in Kazakhstan, I remember when I was at ECM in Kazakhstan, just worrying about what was happening with Chevron, what was happening with the different companies that were trying to operate there, pipelines, connectivity, CASA 1000, all these things. Seeing this region as a region that can contribute in a way that the region itself doesn't always see. And so I think that's another thing that the United States has brought, is an ability to help mediate conflicts, the long-standing conflict between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, which threatened really to be very, very serious at various points. And I do think through international organizations like the World Bank, the United States was helpful in making sure that that didn't boil over to anything more than just the sort of the histrionics that we sometimes heard from each side. So I think that was also extremely important. Just the basic questions of development. It's one thing to be Kazakhstan and have the kinds of resources that that country has, but a country like Tajikistan, or even a country as isolated as Turkmenistan, how are they going to develop as countries so that they're able to provide basic resources for their people? This is an enduring problem, particularly for, I think, the smaller countries, and even for Uzbekistan, which is, I think, still searching for the right formula for its development. And we've been very, very fortunate to have some excellent people from USAID. I'm not sure that we've always figured out the exact right configuration of our development policy and posture, the right mix of resources at any given time. But I think the fact that the United States is there to do things that other countries aren't doing. The Chinese might be putting cameras in the metro, but we're actually trying to invest in the people through our programs. Better health, better education, working with, supporting what the UN is trying to do. These basic questions of development, I think, are still driving factors and extremely important. We've heard about the issue of regional cooperation and how difficult this was, particularly when the country at the very center, the most populous state, resisted cooperation with other countries for so long. And this was really, I think, the breakthrough moment for Central Asia was in 2016 when we had an opportunity, or when Uzbekistan had an opportunity to move in a different direction, and I think that's been really the remarkable story of the last few years. But even before then, in terms of regional cooperation, in 2015 we started formally looking at this idea of the C5+1, but I think there had been some conversations about this even earlier, because there'd been stewing and froing about things like the Eurasian Economic Union of the Russian Federation, about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What did these things mean for the United States, and what should we do either in reaction to or on our own? And I think the C5+1 has kind of given us a platform and format. I'm not sure that the resources that we have attached to it, and even the attention, are going to be sufficient. But as you interviewed Ambassador Wells at UNGA, and I think she was very articulate about how that C5 process is supporting what the United States is trying to do in terms of helping the region find its own feet in terms of a regional identity and trying to work better together. Since it's perfectly fine to want more U.S. direct investment in any one of these countries, but the fact is they're not trading enough with each other. And so trying to build those connections so that they can teach themselves to fish is I think, extremely important. We mentioned the issue that we've had embassies in these countries from the beginning. That's extremely important for countries like Central Asia, where the president is not going to be thinking about this region every day. The Secretary of State is not necessarily going to be thinking about it every day, but we are. As the former ambassadors, as the current sitting ambassadors, as the deputy assistant secretaries, those are the folks who are the day-to-day policy people thinking about this region. And I think we've been very fortunate. I am concerned about what's happening in the State Department in terms of a hollowing out of personnel resources in general over the last, but it doesn't affect only Central Asia. I think it affects us much more broadly than that. Still, in spite of all of that, I think that for Central Asia, we've been doing pretty well over the last couple of years. The C5+1 was embraced by the previous administration, and much to everyone's surprise, it's continued. So I think Secretary Tillerson had one meeting, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he did, and then Pompeo has met. And so that means there's been tremendous continuity.
+1 meeting for Tillerson,
Yeah,
I think. And this
so-
was the first time Pompeo met.
Right, so that's big. That's very, very serious. We've had, for the first time in many, many years, in 2018, a White House visit of the Uzbek president. I think the last time we had a visit like that was in 2006, right?
No, we had President Nazarbayev come too.
Yes, President
Yeah,
Nazarbayev.
yeah.
And when he came, and I remember, the statement that Evan worked on and how hard that was to get that done, given the fact that Central Asia is not necessarily at the top of everyone's list, but when we're able to get senior level attention, it reverberates and it really matters, not only for that particular day, but on into the future. So I think this combination of resources is extremely important to making sure that the United States keeps its focus on Central Asia. Perhaps not as much as we would all like, but certainly that continuity of attention is extremely important. And then just in terms of things that we've been able to do just in the last few years, I think what's interesting and we'll have to watch is the divergence. Because on the one hand, we're starting with Secretary Clinton's speech when she went to Chennai and started talking about connectivity. We've been trying to push this idea of more regional cooperation. But at the same time, what's happening in the region is the countries are both trying to work better together in a more formal sense, but in some ways going off more on their own. So now we have a few of them who are members of the Eurasian Economic Union, and they're working on that together. Kazakhstan is kind of in a class by itself in terms of having invested in its people and now being able to see the fruits of that policy. Uzbekistan playing catch-up since Mirziyoyev began to open the country up a little bit, but it has a long, long way to go in order to keep young people from feeling like they need to find their future elsewhere. And then we have lots of worries about the other states. The Kyrgyz Republic, the foreign minister was here, I guess it was last week, week before last? The 16th or 17th, last week, and Laura and I were both at the presentation. It was very interesting because the Kyrgyz now have a very technocratic, I would say, foreign minister, somebody who knows his brief extremely well. But almost every other paragraph was about how they're members of the Eurasian Economic Union now, but they want a better relationship with the United States. And so I don't know exactly how they're going to be able to play this. They have serious economic problems in the Kyrgyz Republic, and lots of challenges in terms of China and how they're going to manage the relationships. So they've got a lot going on, but one gets the feeling that the situation remains a bit fragile there. Tajiks always seem to be on the verge of being called a failed state, and yet, much to their credit, they are hanging in there. And whatever you want to say about Rahman, I mean, the country is a sovereign state, still not really taking care of its people, though. I mean, really struggling to make sure that some basic things are happening there. And then Turkmenistan becomes more and more of kind of a wild card, and I really have no idea what's happening in Turkmenistan right now. It seems to have gone back to, I mean, I'm not saying it was ever really, it diverged from being very, very closed, but we're just not hearing that much about what's going on in Turkmenistan now. So on the one hand, there's a feeling that Central Asia as a region is sort of coming more into the public mind with things like Smithsonian trips, New York Times trips, so there are more at least well-heeled travelers who are going to the region and learning about it. But the feeling that the region itself is not necessarily developing in a coherent way as each of the leaders makes different choices about what the future of the country is going to be. And here I do think Uzbekistan and some of the changes that have happened over the last few years is extremely important, because now a kind of cooperation that simply was unthinkable a few years ago is now possible. There's tremendous work ahead in every dimension, but they have made progress in human rights. I think you would agree, Steve, that the Uzbekistan that we're seeing now it has many different issues, but you're able to talk to people in a way that you were not able to talk to them when George was there. A lot of different things have happened. Same with the issue of religious freedom. They were on the bad list for many, many years, where they deserve to be. And now they've made some changes. And not that they don't need to make more, but they have made some changes. So little by little, we are seeing changes there in almost every dimension. In the infrastructure, just the way the country looks. In the ability of people to travel now in a way the citizens were not able to travel before. In the way that government is thinking about the economy, that it isn't all cotton all the time anymore. Now they're trying to think about other things, some kind of manufacturing, some kind of services, horticulture and that sort of thing, with the help of entities like USAID, cooperating with neighbors in a way that we hadn't seen before, on water and on a whole host of things. And so, and many of these changes that we're seeing, and this is why I think we always have to keep our talking points in mind and say them no matter what, because Mirziyoyev must have been behind some kind of curtain when some of the talking points were made that not everybody wanted to hear, because some of the things he's doing now.
Notes.
Yes, and he's beginning to do them. So, and they're his initiatives. They're not us wagging our finger. It's the government itself trying to make some changes. And I think, again, the United States has played a very, very important role in that as a balancer, as a country to encourage, as a way to kind of focus on what should be aspirational, as a developer of standards and new ways of doing things, encouraging young people. I think the United States could do a lot more, but I don't want to sell short what we have done already. And clearly, one of the challenges we have now is there's so much going on, and it's very, very hard for this administration to keep its focus. But in spite of that, we are going to have some kind of new policy. We hope it will be rolled out. And I would say, to the credit of the many people who've been working on this issue for a long time, there will be familiar elements to that policy, and there should be, because many of the questions that we've been talking about are questions that have existed for a very long time. The last thing I'll just say in terms of the rise of China, I don't really know quite what to think about that for Central Asia. I know that these countries are pragmatic. They understand that they've got elephants tromping around. They've got Russia, the United States, they have China. We haven't even talked about the Gulf and the role of Islam and all the things that are happening. Iran, India. Those things are also important, and the fact that they are holding it together and keeping their focus on what they want to do, using the United States as a balancer, trying to play a role where they can. I'll use the example of Afghanistan. And both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have tried to play, I think, a constructive role when we have asked them to, and even in their own interest. But they've got a lot to manage, and so do we. And so I think given all of that, what's happening now is about what we could expect. So my hope is that we will maintain a kind of resource base there in terms of assistance, but we do need to grow the commercial relationships in all of these countries, knowing that the United States is far away and that our companies have lots of choices about where they can be, knowing that the economy globally is really changing. But I think that there's more that can be done in the commercial area, and I would like to see that happen. Culturally, George is right. We don't know enough about these countries. We need more exchange of information. We need to keep developing the cadre of people who not only work there for a tour in a kind of perfunctory way, but really enjoy the region, really get it under their fingernails and want to be there. And I think I've talked to some of the desk officers and some of the people who are working. I know my staff, wonderful, wonderful people in the Foreign Service. We just need to keep feeding that pipeline so that we will have those people to work in the future as these relationships continue and they grow. For the future, what am I worried about? I am worried about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of these states, given everything that is going on right now. I think that's a question that we always need to have in the forefront. The environment, the Aral Sea, the lack of water, these changes are very, very serious for these countries. Youth. I asked, my question to the foreign minister of the Kyrgyz Republic is, are you able to hang on to your young people? And his answer was a bit equivocal, but it's a struggle. And so this is going to be a serious problem for the future of these countries. I'm not sure how the United States can help, but again, to the extent that they're willing to engage us on an issue like that, that's something that we also should be talking about. So let me just say, for me, it was an enormous honor and privilege to serve As the ambassador in the Kyrgyz Republic and in Uzbekistan, we have done a lot, but there's a lot to do. There's a lot I didn't cover and could have touched on, but I'll leave it there and just once again thank everybody for coming and just say how wonderful it is to see my colleagues and always learn something new, even though we've known each other for a long time, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. This was very interesting to hear how you notice this major shift in the way Central Asians view themselves, in the way they work with each other now, and the way they communicate with each other. Because we too, I mean, as journalists, we cannot miss that change. On one hand, they want to be seen as these, representatives of unique national identities. They definitely don't want to be seen as former Soviets anymore. But on the other hand, they now realize that they need to work with each other. And yet, you have major differences between the governments, between like the natures of these governments. You were in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. You were in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, which are two different animals in so many different ways. And Ambassador Kennedy, you were in Turkmenistan at two different times, one under Niyazov and under Berdimuhamedov. So I would like you to talk about the differences, how you navigated, how you adapted, and how you balanced your priorities. I mean, Ambassador Spratlen, you were in Kyrgyzstan when Russia was pressuring Kyrgyzstan and you still had the air base to keep, right? And you witnessed how Manas closed. Ambassador Krol, you advocated for closer relationship with Islam Karimov because of Afghanistan. You, in a way, you continued what Ambassador Norland started before you. Basically, let's talk to the Uzbeks.
A working relationship.
Right, yeah. And many saw that as quite transactional, right? I mean, let's go get this done. Let's work on Afghanistan because we can, and then continue the conversation to open up the conversation to include more issues. And there are many people in Washington, I know, Clark Adams argues that, even off the record. No, but there is this argument, when we mentioned Uzbekistan a lot, there is this argument in Washington which basically says that the way we worked with Uzbekistan helped Uzbekistan eventually. The strategy that we used with Uzbekistan, in a way like let's focus on things that we can do now, in a way led Uzbekistan to where it is now. Whereas we could have just shut the doors and say, okay, you're not gonna, okay, fine, well, we want to hear more on that. But anyways, so let's hear a little bit more about the differences and how you navigated and adapted as you moved from one big country to another. Go ahead, Ambassador.
Well, one thing I'd say about differences is that you mentioned, differences of the government, but what I've seen, in my time in Central Asia, as well as throughout the former Soviet Union, is, the differences that are among the people themselves. I mean, when I was in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or elsewhere and asked people, like, how often have you traveled, Uzbeks traveled to Kyrgyzstan? Because in the past they could just get for a few rubles you could fly, take buses, Tashkent to Issyk-Kul and the like, and people knew one another, of course, crossing the borders, because the borders really didn't exist. Many of them were in the institutions of the Soviet Union where they all got to, of course there was the lingua franca of Russian, but also the Communist Party, serving in the Soviet military, so that, the defense minister of Kazakhstan knew the defense minister of Kazakhstan because they served together. And since they were Central Asians in the Soviet system, they were kind of put in a special category and they didn't get the highest ranking jobs, and so they felt this certain solidarity. And in fact, so a lot of the younger people, I said, do you go to Uzbekistan from Kazakhstan? Have you ever been to Samarkand or Bukhara? No. Why would I want to, there are visas or there are things that they have. And plus, the routes, the trains and air, all that is, it's very difficult to get around Central Asia, as we all know. And one of the reasons why you don't get that many visitors coming from Washington is it's far away, but also there are all these circuitous routes. I mean, there's, I think just Uzbek Air has a direct flight from New York to, to Tashkent and the like too. And that's something that you see when I'd ask students, when I'd see them all together, like in Almaty and something like that from various countries of Central Asia, and say, how do you get to know each other? And they said, well, the only way we've ever met each other was when we were studying together in the United States. And, you know, and the Americans all think, oh, you're the Russian speaking, you're the, you know, and then they all had to say the same thing whenever they ask, you know, an American asks, well, where are you from? And they say Kazakhstan. Oh, Afghanistan? Is that everyone's, you know, because that's Afghanistan is in the game. So, but that's, it's a division with, because of, well, sovereignty, independence, but also the Soviet, you know, system itself, you know, while all those ties that connected them all were broken, and bringing them back is very difficult, and it's very costly too. You know, all the things like waterworks, the infrastructure that was all shared and everything. Who's going to pay for all of that? And I think what you're saying, though, however, now is that even the Central Asians, the leaders are saying, well, you know, a realization we have to work together ourselves for our future, because otherwise it will be imposed on us from the outside, including you, the Americans, too. So they want to be more, as it were, independent, but they are in a vulnerable position because you got China, you know, and Russia, and, you know, Iran, India, Pakistan there. The U.S. is sort of farther away, and they kind of like having, they would like to have more attention from the United States, but not the type of attention that they would get, you know, for, you know, congressional hearings and things like that. I said, you know, you're, or being a problem case, like this, it's terrorism or something like that, and you get all the attention there. So, you know, I do find that while it's you know, there are also, you know, the good and the bad sides, but the fact that as people, they're becoming more distant. They don't travel. They don't, you know, mix together that well. And you go to like the military academies, and all these officers there, they're all, you know, they're Uzbek or they're Kazakh, they're a national interest, that, and it's not a matter that they know anybody who is from Kyrgyzstan, like, and also that those differences come up in their view of how they view their neighbors as being, you know, if you're down there in South Kazakhstan and like, oh my God, all these Uzbeks are coming in, you know, now that the border's open. So that, you know, it can be good, but it also has
But you dealt with President Krymov,
Yeah.
and then you dealt with President Nazarbayev,
Yeah.
who knew each other very well, who had each other's back on many issues.
Well, yeah.
And
yeah.
I mean, what was it like to, you know, to go from Tashkent to Astana? And we want to hear more on that.
Well, I mean, you know, they're different personalities and different types of leaders, and they would let you know how different they were from each other. Too. But, I just don't. Now that he is dead, I mean, President Krymov, when he found that I was appointed ambassador to Kazakhstan, you know, I was called to the Aksaray at night. I was wondering, like, what did I do? And there I was. It was late, you know, and everything, because he liked these things very kind of dramatic and. You know, and he said, so you don't like our country? Said, what do you mean? You know, and he says, well, why are you going there? You know, to there. I said, well, you know, Mr. President, you know,
They know so much about the way American
when a president tells you to go, you go. You know. And everything. He says, well, you're going to starve up there. I said, what do you mean? He says, you know, they eat horses up there. You know? What, you don't like our plov?
Uzbeks eat horses?
You don't like our plov? You know, and I said, I love your plov. And he said, well, you're going to, you know. So then it was like, and it's cold up there. That's how they know. I said, you don't know how cold. I was just there 2 weeks ago, and I froze my, you know, use the Russian word for what he froze off. And he said, you're going to freeze. I said, yeah, well, you know, I'm used to the cold and everything. Well, you know, I don't like this and everything too. But then he kind of smiled. He said, you know, if you need warmth, you need food, you know, you can come back here. And so when I got up to, you know, to Kazakhstan, you know, and after presenting credentials, and then we had an opportunity a little later to have a conversation with the president there, and he said, you know, are you hungry here? Are you cold? You know, and everything else. I said, you're very well informed, Mr. President. So he said, well, we talk to each other, you know, despite it also. So that, there's certainly that rivalry and that very deep, and I wouldn't, you know, they came from the same, but in a different way and the like. And I think they had, and I think for President Nazarbayev, his feeling about President Krymov, well, you know, if it, you know, it was the fact of keeping a stable Uzbekistan was important despite everything else that he did. And I think for Karimov, it was also that, out of the ruins of the former Soviet and how something was built, like Kazakhstan, warts and all, was an achievement that they both had and suffered from as well. So there's a certain grudging admiration for each other, too, and to understand what these people went through and, and their personal feelings and everything is so important. And, it's just that we have to listen, and try to understand that. Anyways.
Thank you. Ambassador Spratlen, Kyrgyz democracy versus Uzbek autocracy. I guess that's how it was viewed, right?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose that's one way to look at the difference between the two countries, but I would prefer to focus on a couple of other things.
Sure.
And one would be size, because I think size matters a lot. It's important to remember that there are over 30 million Uzbeks, and the population of the Kyrgyz Republic, and Kadir can correct me if I'm wrong, is around 6 million or so. And so you're talking about countries that have very different self-perceptions on the basis of just of size. Uzbekistan is very proud of being the largest country by population in the region. It also sees itself as the country that was the settled place, and it harkened back often to this idea that they were the country, the ones to watch the leaders during the Soviet time. And I think in some ways this race to change is a way of trying to catch up and, if they can, perhaps surpass the Kazakhs. So I think the size issue is extremely important, just in the way the Kyrgyz have to remember that they're not very large, and they've got these much larger regional states near them, Kazakhstan by geographic size and even by population. It's almost 3 times as big as the Kyrgyz Republic by population, and then Uzbekistan. So, and then you have China. So trying to maintain a sense of coherence and national identity in a very mobile population is not an easy thing to do. The thing that was most striking to me is the way the Kyrgyz saw the Uzbeks in 2010 and 2011, when the events just spilled over, as they often do, and when Islam Karimov made the decision to allow the Uzbek population to go to Uzbekistan. And I would often hear from the Kyrgyz leadership, in spite of the great differences in their perceptions of their political trajectories and what they needed to be trying to accomplish in terms of political reform, but there was a great deal of gratitude to the Uzbeks for that decision. The other thing I would say, just about size, is because Uzbekistan is so large by population and divided up with the population center in the Fergana Valley, it's important to remember that there's a lot more congruence once you get to the valley between the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz. And I think one of the things you mentioned is that there are a lot of Uzbeks who listen to your program from the Kyrgyz Republic, because they speak.
And Tajikistan.
Yeah, so we have to remember how these countries were all started, and the fact that even within one country there may be different perceptions of the other based on exactly where someone is. But you're right, there are some great differences, and it was always striking to me when I was in the Kyrgyz Republic of just how comfortable the Kyrgyz were with conflict. I mean, I don't want to say comfortable, but it was just part of life. There wasn't the same need that I felt in Uzbekistan for stability, for the face of everything to be controlled, to be predictable, to be understood in a certain kind of image about what is Uzbek, whereas the Kyrgyz were a good deal more relaxed about that, and I would end up being in a yurt with President Otunbayeva and her family, and just kind of hanging out and sitting there with them. And it was a very, very different level of formality between the two cultures. But obviously, it wasn't only a question of size and just their sort of basic approach to things, but the experiences that they had. I think for the Kyrgyz, as hosts of the Manas facility, there were many, many people, and we forget this because it is no more, but there were many people who were very happy and proud about the fact that we were there, that they were playing an important role. A lot of people liked that. But the reality was, it was a constant source of friction with their major strategic partner, the Russians. And where Islam Karimov, and again, this is an issue of size, could every once in a while kind of show certain body parts to folks in Moscow and tell them what they thought about Russia's influence, that was a lot harder to do if you're in the Kyrgyz Republic. And so things like joining the Eurasian Economic Union, asking us to close Manas. These things are, I think, kind of challenges for a country that is Kyrgyzstan's size. I think it has the aspiration, of course, to be an independent state, to pursue its own course, and frankly, they've really done an amazing job of trying to, I would say it's less clear now, but to try to move forward with this political reform path first. It hasn't been easy. It's been very, very challenging, and yet they've stuck to it. They've had peaceful transfer of power. You know, things have been a bit wobbly, but they've managed to keep things going. Prime minister's in jail and all the rest of it, and still they move forward and they maintain themselves. With Uzbekistan, it's a lot more opaque in terms of where things are going politically. The idea of having a central control still seems very important. Ambassador Wells recently called President Mirziyoyev a modernizer, and I think that's a good word for him. He is trying to make the country more modern, but not necessarily a political reformer. I would say that everything is still being run from Tashkent, and the voice, whereas I think Kyrgyz people expect their voices to be heard. They'll gather at the square and they'll tell everybody what they think. Whereas in Uzbekistan, I would say that is still very much led by a centralized control. So I would say those are two big differences that I saw when I was there.
Good, thank you. Ambassador Kennedy? Thank you. Oh, we have, you can use that.
You
Yeah,
can
we
use your
have
own,
two
but
mics.
I think the microphone might not.
Yeah, we want to put it on.
Can you turn it on?
Yeah, it's right there.
Okay, I think George and Pamela very usefully talked about the navigating different interests among the U.S. And indeed within these different countries, because there are different groups, just as there are in any nation, who have different interests and are vying for attention and resources and so on. Perhaps least so, of course, in Turkmenistan, which is so heavily dominated by the president. One thing I might say, though, and I agree with George, that in independence we knew so little about these countries, and that's why I valued, for example, having been an exhibit guide and getting a chance to get out of the capitals and meet people. I disagree a little bit in that I have been so impressed by the development of our cadres over the years. I mean, look at these two ambassadors. I mean, repeat ambassadors with multiple assignments in Washington and so on. Other ambassadors that we have out there. When I was just out there, I went to see my old friend Dan Rosenblum in Uzbekistan. Decades spent working on assistance programs for Central Asia. Don Liu, again, a repeat offender, I might say. Just the officers I met when I was just out there in September. One young officer had been a Peace Corps in Turkmenistan, first assignment in the State Department, Kyrgyzstan, now serving in Uzbekistan. By the way, I will say that Peace Corps, of which I'm a huge fan, I hope will return to Uzbekistan. Look at what the Peace Corps has contributed, I think, in these countries, but also what a resource of people that have served in men and then go on to work in NGOs or the government or so on. Huge resource, so I do hope that Uzbekistan takes it back. I can't agree more in terms of, I think, the centrality of Uzbekistan. It's always been, the beating heart of Central Asia, although that's what Assad said about Syria, so I guess I should rephrase that. But when I went back to the New York Times and the Smithsonian last month, I crossed the land borders without a diplomatic visa. It's the first time I'd ever done that. Let me tell you, huge difference. But it gives you a sense of the changes that are going on. And it was as if the border guards in Uzbekistan had gone to good border guard school. Huge changes in terms of the ease of getting visas, the ease of which citizens are able to cross. There's still all sorts of rules. I was fascinated, for example, at the Uzbek border, where they have lists of how many of X goods you can import or within a month. But they are so key, I think, to the area loosening up and getting this regional connectivity going that we've talked about. So, for example, just to go back, when I was there in 2014, briefly as the chargé, the water issue had really heated up. And so we were madly working with the World Bank, with the conflict center of the UN there in Turkmenistan, because Grumov was saying, you build Rogun and that's war. Now we have a very different situation, and I hope and I think that our government can be nimble enough to take advantage of those new opportunities in Uzbekistan. And again, I hope that it'll have those spillover effects on other countries. But it's still a challenge. Let me go back to the American University of Central Asia, when George, I think, said that we find that many different say that the only time they've talked to you is that they're out of the country. Well, this is why institutions like this can be so valuable and why we were so happy to support them in the early years. This was an opportunity where you could develop those ties and networks and so on. So I hope indeed that we'll have other countries going there. Again, in terms of the difficulty of navigating these countries, classic case Turkmenistan, one of the most opaque countries out there. When I went in 2001, I was confirmed within 24 hours because it was because of course September 11th made such a big difference and they were eager to get me out there. So obviously supporting the war in Afghanistan was vitally important, but you try, I did, and I think all my colleagues always did. How do you pursue vital U.S. interests, which are very real and extremely important, without compromising American values? And I think there's ways you can do it. So for example, when I would speak publicly, I always talked about the ties between the U.S. and the Turkmen people. And then I just say, of course, it's no surprise that there are many things that we disagree on the government with, but I tried to use my real firepower for when I was sitting down with Niyazov and arguing about programs that were of importance. I used my pathetic Turkmen language skills by when I gave public presentations, getting my little speech and doing it in Turkmen, because I knew that that gave me an entree for this big cultural nationalist. I also knew that if I could say something in Turkmen, there would be less likelihood that they would put words in my mouth. So if you ever heard me say some nonsense, that was probably voiced over. I mean, but it's always a challenge. But again, language I think is very important. And going back to sort of the smart power things, how do you find those things that are of enduring interest? English language. These countries are very, they know that this gives them entree and so on. Development programs, Pamela alluded to, extremely important. And I think we've got a new opening in Uzbekistan that I think is vitally important. But it's always a challenge. And what I mentioned about sort of the third chapter, as as this president seems to want to sort of move on from Afghanistan, does that mean that Central Asia becomes a backwater? I don't think so. It will always have to fight with any other area for attention at senior levels. But I think developing cadres, people who understand the area and why this area is important, managing expectations, because it's not Russia, it's not China, it's not India. One of the things I had worried about earlier, though, in sort of this second period where Afghanistan became obviously a driving force was, does this area become just derivative of Afghanistan, which I think would be selling this area short. And that was always a bit of a challenge, simply because for example, the CENTCOM commander would come through, the military would come through. They had planes, they could visit, easily. And so does this sort of the military presence start driving out other areas? But I think we've worked hard, but that's why when Pamela talked about the hollowing out, this is a problem we face all over the world. That's a challenge, because you need the resources, you need to be out there showing the American flag and showing American values. And when I talked about the importance of public diplomacy and American values and so on, I've always been very proud to represent my government, even though there were issues I didn't agree with them on. But frankly, I worry now about the picture that this administration, and I'm a private citizen, is showing to the world now. I think it's been much more difficult, and I'm speaking only for myself, for American diplomats to be out there talking about American values and talking about the importance of corruption-free, free market groups, the importance of rule of law and so on, when we're presenting a very unattractive picture, I think, to the world outside. So that's what worries me. That's a challenge for all of us as American citizens.
Well, let's open the floor for questions. Okay, we go with Steve, Jennifer, and then Clark. Wow, okay, 3 of you. Right away. Go ahead. We have a mic here. And please, Steve, I mean, we know who you are, but introduce yourself again.
For Human Rights Watch, I want to thank all of you for your service, patriotism, and I really mean that word. Thank you for spending so many hours talking with me and Human Rights Watch over the years about human rights and democracy, and I know how committed you all are. I did want to ask about some of the war stories, some of the things you can talk about now, hopefully, about those difficult moments raising individual human rights cases. Can you share some insights and perspectives about moments when you had to go to the mat and talk about someone detained or tortured, what worked, what didn't work, what you had to weigh, and maybe some of the advice that you give to your colleagues now that are in places like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And I agree with what was said about these contrasts. Despite Kyrgyzstan being what it is and Uzbekistan now looking the way it is, we still have Azimjan Askarov in prison for 9 years, a journalist, a human rights defender. We have Max Bolkaev in Kazakhstan. So these issues are now and very real. So I'm very curious to hear about some of those war stories and challenges you face.
Jennifer, go ahead.
I'm Jennifer Murtazashvili. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm also a former Peace Corps volunteer from Uzbekistan and still recovering USAID Democracy and Governance Officer from USAID in Uzbekistan from the late 90s, early 2000s. And my question, I think there was like an inherent tension in many of the points that the 3 of you made. And I also want to thank you, Navbahor, for putting this wonderful panel together, and thanks all of you for coming. We heard about value. We've heard about finger wagging. And please understand that I'm asking this question from a position of great sympathy, because I've worked in this area for a long time, care very deeply about it, wondering how the U.S. can be more effective in these areas. And so inherent tensions between sovereignty, an issue that's been raised here, perceptions of sovereignty, raising values, talking about democracy and democracy promotion. And I'm wondering if you could share some lessons for people who are working in this area right now. What do you think the lessons that you have learned about promoting democracy, promoting good governance in the region? If you could have done things differently, if you could have brought that USAID mission out of Almaty into your capital city, what would you have done differently? I think this is a question that, looking at the outcomes that we see now, what kind of both strategic and tactical issues would you have done differently?
Do you want to answer this one, these 2 first, and then because I think Clark, your question, is it about democracy or?
You can go ahead and answer.
Sure. Okay, let's go. Let's
Clark is one of the great defenders.
Yeah, no, let's go ahead and take these 3 questions. Yes, please. Yeah.
Clark Adams, Central Asia Director in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I think it's a unique opportunity right now to have both Ambassador Spratlen and Ambassador Krol here, because you were present at the transition, if I will, and I think Navbahor made a comment earlier, kind of paraphrasing my view. But what I was really getting at is, for a long time, our strategy toward Uzbekistan was like waiting for Krylov to die. And that was kind of where we were stuck. However, in 2008, 2009, because of the Afghanistan support issues and everything else, we started to engage more heavily in the security area. We started to, I think, reverse the relationship that had tanked after Andijan. And the question really gets to is, Mirziyoyev was sitting in the back of the room or in the side of the room for more than a decade. He was thinking about this. How did we set ourselves up? How did the things that you were doing, Ambassador Krol, help to inspire confidence in Mirziyoyev to really make the approaches and open up to Ambassador Spratlen as quickly as they did? I think they were happy with us. Did it make a difference? How did it work? And kind of looking toward the future, where are the other Mirziyoyevs? Where are the other young reformers, basically, within the Uzbek bureaucracy, Uzbek politicians who actually want to continue the path of Mirziyoyev is on?
Thank you. Yes, go on. You start.
As far as preparing Mirziyoyev, I never met him. I wanted to meet him, but Karimov was, he would lay down the law who any ambassador could meet with, and it would be with him, if anyone at all. And so, although one time, I happened to see Mirziyoyev at a function, and he said, "Oh, let's get together." So I immediately contacted back, and I never got an answer back because I think it had to go through other levels, too. However, I'd say that, and this goes at democracy building and everything, is to understand the forces at play here, and the fact that it's not just an individual, it's not just a Karimov or a Nazarbayev or I'd say a Mirziyoyev. There's a system, and there's a bureaucracy in there, and bureaucracies by nature, including in our own country, are very conservative. They don't like change, and they like doing things because that's what they're there to, and for better or for worse, I like too. And I think the big challenge for somebody, I think Karimov was supposed to be a reformer too. I mean, Gorbachev put him in there basically to clean up after the scandals of Rashidov. And he was not a member of the clans. He, was picked out. He was a planner. He was, considered an honest fellow in that context, too. But again, encountered the deep-seated way of doing business in Uzbekistan that, as much as he would try by putting the power in his own hands, but all these things that he couldn't control underneath there about the continuation of ways of doing business. And I think we see this in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, that real reform, in a way, I mean, it would almost have to tend to be revolutionary, but then what would be the result of that? More chaos, no one knows. And so there's a real sense of don't rock the boat. And I think while they all would like to modernize, and again, Karimov said, I want investment, I want modernization, and they all do, but they don't want to change. It's so hard to change the way of doing business. And I think I found many, young Uzbeks and Kazakhs who went on, the LEAD program or Bolshak, and they come back, and it's like they're both basically thought they were there to basically help transform the country. And then what they're saying is they come back and they're put in a ministry or a company, and it says, you're back home now. You'll do things the Uzbek way or the Kazakh way, or it's the highway. And they felt very frustrated, and they would go to leaders or others and say, "What can I do? I went to Maxwell School of Business or whatever," and it was like, well, it takes time. I mean, evolution is very long. Stick with it and everything. And it says, I can't work in this environment, so they go. And this is one of the things, even with the educational exchanges and everything, people come back and come in and meet, as it were, the system of how it operates, how that will change. I mean, I've talked to people in Ukraine. I had served there too. One of the, what's going to really change if it's not some really fundamental thing? And that, of course, is very frightening, and it's destabilizing and they went through that when the Soviet Union collapsed. But one could say, well, the fact they had these institutions of the Soviet Union that were there made it so it wasn't like, the millions who died when the partition of India and things like that. But so I think, we have to look at this in the context. And that's very hard because for America, in America, because we want change so bad, and we think it can be done. When you say well, what could we do better or something like that? Well, to realize even the concept or the idea of democracy, which we think conceptually is so great, I would find many Uzbeks or Kazakhs or others, and even Kyrgyz, when I had people saying, if what's happening in Kyrgyzstan and these revolutions and everything is democracy, that we don't want this as an example. I mean, maybe less so in Kyrgyzstan because it's the system, but the violence, the upheaval, a lot of people don't like, and they feel they're more comfortable with it. And listening to that, and they say, well, how are you, when you talk about democracy, and they're like, it's often, if it's the people and what the people want, it may not be something that, is going to be too pretty, because if you're looking that people look at themselves, there's rich and there's poor, and the poor are left out of the system, and that then becomes, a big issue. anyways, I just wanted to make that point. So.
Well, what I would say, since I served in the Kyrgyz Republic and then went to Uzbekistan immediately following Ambassador Krol, the importance of just keeping doors open. I think this is extremely important. Some of you may remember Nelson Letsky, who was with the NDI for many years. And you may also recall that there was an NDI representative office in Uzbekistan for many, many years. I tried to keep them from closing, and they ultimately decided things had just gotten too difficult. But what he always said, and I remember this just from having talked to him, is it doesn't matter whether it's one person sitting in an office with a light on, as long as there's a door header out there that says NDI. From him, it was keeping the doors open. And so the thing for which I was extremely grateful is that before me in Uzbekistan, there had been these very careful and professional ambassadors who were quite pragmatic about dealing with Islam Karimov, who clearly was an extremely tough leader to work with. So many things were difficult. And it's also important for people, and especially if you've been a Peace Corps in the region, just to think about 2005 and what a rupture that was with Andijan. It was huge. And even though there might have been some things that DOD was able to do because there was a pragmatic need to cooperate more over Afghanistan, the fact was the trust had been broken. And so we were spending a lot of time trying to rebuild trust. And part of the reason that was possible was because of the respect that Ambassador Krol and Ambassador Norland had shown the leadership within the parameters of our policy. And what that meant was, because that had been done, then when I came, I would say I was in the latest Karimov period. He was tired. Mm-hmm. He was getting older. There were people who were starting to talk, not openly, but they were starting to talk about this can't go on. Mm-hmm. And so there was a feeling of getting to the end of something. It just wasn't clear how they were going to get out of it. And I remember I tried to meet with Mirziyoyev also, and I was promised a meeting with Mirziyoyev. And the day before I was supposed to meet with him, of course, the meeting fell apart. So we were trying to figure out, as you know, as we heard earlier, one of the keys to the way we approach this region was, when are these leaders passing on? And they are, very comfortable and well taken care of, so they're going to last for a while. So before I went to Uzbekistan, people would say to me, "Oh, you'll be there for the transition." I said, I don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know what's going to happen in the region. The folks are very healthy all over the region in terms of the leadership, and we'll just see what happens. But then there actually was a change. Now, what had happened before made certain things possible, and certain things were impossible. So I do remember having a conversation with a senior official, and I tried to raise the issue on the anniversary of Andijan. And I was told that the issue of Andijan was closed. And so where do you go after that? You don't really have a place to go. And so that to me was a signal, okay, now's not the moment. We're not going to push this. We're going to wait and see what the traffic will bear each moment, always showing respect and always trying to build more trust. I would say there were certain events, and here's where I think the government and the NGO community, not working together in any way, but complementing in some ways efforts. There was one human rights activist in Uzbekistan who had become kind of a flashpoint over the issue of the cotton harvest. This was Yelena Relieva. And some of the treatment that she had received was really beyond the pale. And so showing support for her, first in some nonverbal ways, just through photographs, I think that was important, and it was a signal that, okay, this has gone too far, so you need to figure out something else because this is not acceptable. I didn't have to say anything. Just meeting with the individual, having the picture published, that was one way of respectfully making clear what the United States would accept and not accept, or what our message was about where the lines were. And I think because of handling things that way trying to be respectful of them, but clear about what we wanted to see happen, made it possible. I would also say, I don't know if anybody's here from the Congress, but these lists that people put together are, on the one hand, they drive you nuts. You know, because you've got senator or congressman so-and-so with this or that list of this particular activist or that activist, and you're supposed to go in and try to get X or Y or Z person freed. In a way, the lists ended up being useful because they were a way of saying symbolically, here are some people about whom we're concerned. We know there could be dozens, hundreds of other people who are also in the same soup, but getting those first activists released in Uzbekistan was huge. And then I think when Mirziyoyev came, and that, remember, that happened when Karimov was still alive.
Right. They started releasing them while he was still alive.
One big, who was the person? I'm blanking on the name right now. But anyway.
Jurayev?
No, it wasn't Jurayev. It was, I can't remember. Anyway, there was an activist who was released by Karimov, and that was a huge kind of symbol. And then we all just kind of played it by ear then, of trying always to raise the issue, but not pushing it so that we would go too far, knowing that this was important to many people. Again, there are different poles in the U.S. government, as Ambassador Krol has said. Some people, look, security, 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 we're going to deprioritize human rights. Others, human rights, human rights, human rights, we're going to deprioritize, or we don't care about security. So you are, as an ambassador, in this very, very delicate position, but in my view, both positions represent the United States, and so both positions have to be pursued. Not necessarily at the same pace, in the same way for every single day, but you're going to keep moving. So in the issue of religious freedom, we were seeing raids on churches, and so quiet diplomacy. We're not putting out any statements, but we're making very clear to the relevant ministries, this is unacceptable. Here are the names of the congregations, and those sorts of things ended up being helpful in motivating some behavior change. But I think the larger point is that we really are starting from extremely different places on this key issue of values. What is the importance of political reform, and what is the importance of democracy? And I think the Kyrgyz Republic has probably had to sort of deal with this more than the other countries, because they made the decision in a very, very challenging way, and they made the statement twice that this was going to be the priority. And then what was interesting was when their former president, who was previously, when our wonderful Ambassador Jovanovic was there in the Kyrgyz Republic, he was an activist. But things changed when the shoe was on the other foot and he was in power. And then we saw a very, very different person evolving. And I think there were serious concerns about what was going to happen with this political reform democracy path for the Kyrgyz Republic. Fortunately, they seem to have at least come to a modus vivendi. The parliament is still operating. The president is still in his role. Certain people who went to excess have been removed from the scene. And so whether they're pursuing it with the same vigor that they did before, I don't know. And balancing being members of the Eurasian Economic Union, having Russia as a main strategic partner, and still maintaining some kind of commitment to democracy and political reform is important. Now, I had an opportunity to visit Azamjan Askarov when I was in the Kyrgyz Republic. I think I was probably the last ambassador to see him. It's been some years. I think it's just something that we need to remember, a long way to go. And again, the individuals who are perceived in a particular way by us are not necessarily perceived that same way in the region. And we have to remember that. This is going to be what Colin Powell talked about, the slow, patient work, right? That we're going to keep doing and making progress in our estimation where we can, knowing, again, that these regions have not seen democracy, and not only in the Soviet period, there was no democracy before the Russian imperial government arrived in the late 19th century. So we're not talking about hearkening back to some democratic time that they're going to go to, like the Baltic states. This is creating something whole cloth that's new, and I think there are still reservations about whether this will work when everybody else in their neighborhood is using a style of governance that's a lot more comfortable when you have one person in charge of everything. So I would say that even though the sort of mode of the world after the Arab Spring and all the rest of it, I think will continue to push for more democracy, As the middle class rises in these countries, I hope, in Kazakhstan and in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyz Republic, these folks will want a voice in how things, I think it's already happening actually. And Mirziyoyev is trying to figure out how to do that and yet at the same time maintain the control. So it's a fascinating area. We'll have to see how it evolves, and my hope is, so far we've seen it, that we will continue to have very patient and careful professional diplomats who are in these positions of leadership who can balance this very difficult issue of the political reform that we would like to see and the structures of control from the center that are much more comfortable for these governments. It's going to be a long, long road, and we need to remember that. And to Laura's point, our own behavior really matters, because in addition to other things, we are seen as the symbol of what should a healthy, good democratic government do. So if we want to propose that the Venezuelans or somebody else should be Democrats, then we've got to do that ourselves. That's really important.
The last word, Ambassador Kennedy.
Okay. So many points that I agree with, and so emphatically with this point about modeling the behavior that we urge others to adopt. And again, resources. Again, this administration started off by 30% cuts the first year, 30% cuts the next year, 25% the next. Now, as a creature of the executive branch, I used to complain, frankly, a lot about Congress getting their fingers. Well, thank God for Congress, who basically said these budgets are dead on arrival, because we do still matter, but we need to have the resources to do that. I agree with the point that these are ancient civilizations, but young states, so you do have to be patient, you do have to be there. You do have to have those resources. That's also why I believe very strongly in the value of education and exchanges to affect the rising generations. Now, in terms of some of the war stories and what we had to navigate, I guess I picked two examples, and that was I was the DAS in Central Asia, still belonged to the European Bureau during Andijan, which was indeed a very drastic moment in our relations. But frankly, I remember getting that call in the middle of the night with the embassy saying there's been some sort of a prison break or something. I was like, huh? But it was a very confused time. So we tried to avoid going to a rush to judgment and say, let's investigate this. I think we tried to prevent a rupture by saying, let's investigate. But again, relations were already under a great strain even before. On K2, as Clark will remember, about the degradation of the runways and the financing and so on. So it didn't sort of come out of the blue, but it certainly was a difficult moment, which we tried, as I say, initially, and I left the job about a month after this happened, to keep the dialogue open, to avoid just condemning them out of hand and saying sort of what happened, let's work on this. But again, Karimov was, ready for a bit of a rupture. Then also in 2002, I was ambassador during the coup against Niazov, and again, we tried to avoid just condemning him because there had been a coup against him, but focused on rule of law, due process. So there was not a single time that I met with Niazov then or later when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State where I just said access to prisoners, due process, and so on. But a difficult issue, as we all know, none of those prisoners have, been seen to this day. But I just want to make one plea, and that is, if you don't hear an ambassador lambasting publicly a government over human rights, don't think that this is not absolutely part of the dialogue.
Absolutely.
But oftentimes, it's you can be more effective in trying to get some results if you deal with them privately, especially in a place like Turkmenistan where you have one person that's in charge. And also I'd say sort of pick your battles. Obviously when I went as ambassador or was DAS or office director earlier, I wasn't going to go in there and talk about the importance of free and fair elections as my first priority. So I focused, for example, when I was there on civil society. This was very rocky ground. Where are sort of the niches where you can get some grassroots to support? So it was things like getting NGOs registered, getting congregations registered rather than meeting that. I guess it was you had to have a congregation of 500 or something. Issues like that. And I also wanted to say the importance I also found in partnering with organizations like the OSCE, with like-minded countries. And again, going back to the importance of alliances with like-minded states is vital. Something else I worry about when we are kicking sand in the faces of countries that are valuable, valuable allies in many of these countries, because you want to always be able to amplify your message and not be the only one, as you say, out there wagging your finger. So again, developing partnerships I think is vitally important. One of the things I do have a little bit of a concern about is that the proliferation of different reports and report cards. Does that, no, this is, I don't have the answer, but I think it's a debate worth having. Does that make more sense, or does it make more sense to have more of a coherent approach? So that we're talking about overall what we need to tackle rather than having a separate report card for trafficking and religion and so on. I don't know, that's just something to debate. But I tend to believe in more of a coherent approach rather than a piecemeal approach. Let me make one last point, if I didn't make it before, and that is the importance of the academic community. I think, George, you said that sort of like that's not necessarily, top of our agenda.
It's hard to penetrate
exactly,
into
because it is
daily.
true. We're working at the interagency, the dread monster, the interagency process. But I will say, and let me give kudos to all the academics in George Washington University. This has been an amazing change I've seen over 40 years, the development of academic expertise. GW in particular has had fabulous programs bringing together the NGOs, the foundations, the advocacy groups, and government. Every time I've been to a program here, I have seen desk officers from the State Department. Yeah. I think the DAS was going to be here. So I think actually we do pay attention. I think about the National War College, for example, where I had the opportunity to teach a seminar in Central Asia and the Caucasus with Teresa Sabonis Health. So I think there is more interaction between the academic and the government community, but it always can be nurtured. And so again, thank you for letting me be part of this annual conference, and I hope we can continue all of these connections because we are a very complex society in the U.S. And this is what we also want to encourage in these countries, the development of their own academics, NGOs, and so on.
I'd just say a couple things. Just quickly on the issue, I fully agree on the issue of the academic community. I had a chance to make a presentation at the University of Washington earlier this year, and there are these programs that are focusing on Central Asia. It used to be, Indiana, Colombia, a few, right. And now they're all over the country, which is fantastic. Sometimes tied to Russia, sometimes not, but it really is something that's been, I think, expanding, and I think that's very, very good. Just on the issue of the reports, I just wanted to make one point about democracy. One of the reasons we have so many reports is because of the tendency in our own politics for things to be rather fragmented, right? So I would imagine the trafficking community would be loath to give up the trafficking report. The human rights NGOs would be loath to give up the human rights report, and the religious freedom community would be loath to give up the International Religious Freedom Report. So I think it's important for us to remember that, yes, I agree with you. It'd be great if this could all be more coherent, but some of this is driven by our own politics and our own democracy, where people want their own voices to be heard through these reports, channeled through the U.S. government to give them the imprimatur of officialdom that they wouldn't otherwise necessarily have. So I just wanted to make that point.
You see, now I have the last word.
Yes,
sure.
Whoever holds that.
Sure.
One thing I would say, if I had to do all over again, one thing I've learned as a diplomat, I really wish I had studied clinical psychology, because I think I've learned to become a clinical psychologist, because dealing with leaders, dealing with that, these are people after all. And history, politics, all of that, it's psychology, how people think and react is, I find, is most important.
A new discipline for Central Asia studies, you know, political psychology,
Exactly.
or maybe psychology of the Central Asia leaders, or you know.
American diplomats, psychology of
Yeah,
Americans.
American diplomats. No, I mean, we can never have enough time, obviously,
Yeah.
but it's been an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for making time, for being available, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to so many different questions, but a lot of interesting points came up. And we will continue. I mean, I, for one, live and, you know, breathe Central Asia, Uzbekistan every day. There are many of us in Washington who watch very closely what happens there and here. We're very much connected. And all those reports, oh my God, they keep our lives very interesting. And I think ambassadors would have a very different workload if they did not have these reports.
But thank God for journalists. We didn't
Thank
talk
you.
about
No, we didn't.
journalists.
Yes, absolutely.
Keep the flame alive.